Yes, hello again, and a very warm welcome back to your number one and hopefully your favourite classic dirt bike TV channel, where we continue to take a look at more of those old school vintage race bikes from way back in the day. Now, a quick hello here to all the brand new subscribers who have just recently signed up to CDB TV. Thanks again for your commitment to my channel, and I do hope you find something to entertain you in here with regards looking at these old vintage race bikes, because we're not too far away from that 16,000 subscribers total. So thanks once again to everybody who has made the commitment to my YouTube channel. So right now we're going to take a look at a couple of bikes that I haven't featured here on CDB TV for quite some time, so we're going to dive straight into this video right now and take a look at a pair of 1970s Ossa Phantom 250s. Now, over the many years that I've been posting these kind of dirt bike videos, it's probably fair to say that during that time I've featured examples of these Spanish Ossa bikes, maybe once or even twice in the last 20 years. Now, that's not to say that these Ossa 250 Phantoms weren't good bikes, because they did have a very good chassis, a decent two-stroke motor, and of course the looks of a machine that would certainly appeal to many European and even international riders of that early 1970s period. Now, our featured Ossa Phantom here is yet another one of the quality bikes that I spotted at the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and this bike here belongs to Gary Warr, who races this machine quite regularly at various classic and vintage race meetings around the UK. But as you know, I'm certainly no expert on these Ossa Phantoms, but I'm pretty sure that this is a 1974 or maybe even a 1975 model. Maybe not a fully stock original bike, of course, but then again, this bike of Gary's is not a display or self-styled show machine. Gary has but one purpose for this particular Phantom here, and that's to race it on the track as often as he can. Now, the history of Ossa really dates back to 1924, when it was founded by Manuel Giro, and at that time he began by manufacturing movie projectors for the home Spanish market, before then eventually moving on to build motorcycles just after World War II. And in the 1960s they began exporting their bikes to other European countries, before then selling them on to North American markets in the USA and Canada. But the abbreviation of the Ossa brand name stood for Orfeo Synchronic Sociedad Anónima, which was the company's first working title, and the cloverleaf insignia that Ossa used denotes a component that was used in cinema projectors' workings, which also dates back to when the company was first formed. Although, to get back to our featured Ossa now, back in 1974, these 250 Phantoms were very quick bikes, and straight from the packing crate, these Ossa Phantoms were more than capable of winning races, because the chassis was quite light and very strong, and it also had a good two-stroke motor as well. And in fact, these 250 Phantoms were said to be the very first off-road 250 dirt bike to tip the scales at under the 200 pound mark, which was also 15 pounds lighter than the mighty 250 Honda Elsinore, which was possibly the world's best-selling 250 off-roader in that year. But you can certainly see the appeal that these Phantoms had back in that glorious time of the early 1970s, because they were a cracking looking machine with that electric blue and orange themed paintwork. And after nearly 50 years on the racetrack, Gary's bike here still looks very fresh for an old timer. Now these piston port 250 two-stroke motors that were fitted to these Phantoms were pretty hardy little power plants, and as I remember they had a bore of around 72mm and a stroke of about 60mm, and on a good day these engines would push out around the 33 horsepower mark, which wasn't too shabby for such a small 250, but back in 1974 it would probably have been a 36mm Bing carburetor that would have been bolted on to this engine, but it was quite common for them to be swapped for this much more tunable Mikuni unit. But normally it was a 5-speed gearbox as well on these stiletto Phantom engines, along with a wet multi-plate clutch and CDI Motoplat electronic ignition system. And for a very small European manufacturer like Ossa, these were still powerful, compact little engines. Now once again, and because this was still the early 1970s, many of the off-road bike manufacturers of that time were still designing their machines with these underslung exhaust systems, which, as you'd expect, suffered quite a bit of damage as a result, although it's said that the exhaust and primarily the tailpipe on these Phantoms were pretty loud and quite noisy, and subsequently riders did tend to just cut that part of the tailpipe off and then substitute it for their very own tailpiece. And as you can see, Gary's done that very same modification on his little Phantom by adding this aluminium tail cone on the exhaust. And once again on these 250 Phantoms for 1974, it would have been a set of Beator front forks that would have been bolted on to these Ossa bikes, the very same suspension units, of course, that were also used on the Spanish Bull Tacos at that time. But again, at the rear of Gary's bike, it would have been a set of Beta rear shocks that were fitted at the Ossa factory, although after 48 years of track action, it's certainly no surprise that Gary's now changed them for these modern day Falcon suspension systems. Although for me personally, these Ossa Phantoms certainly had one of the nicest colour schemes on a 250 motocrosser, with this sort of electric blue and orange striped livery on the tank and the mudguards. And as you can see, this fuel cell was quite slim in its stature, but it still held around just over 2 gallons of pre-mixed fuel, which was usually enough to feed that powerful 250 two-stroke motor on even the longest of race motos. Now the handlebars on Gary's bike once again aren't the stock 1974 parts, as these are a pair of modern day rental handlebars with a set of period correct Magura levers and gasser throttle. But Gary's more than likely just fitted these as a matter of personal preference, rather than there being anything wrong with regards the original Ossa handlebars. Although these next few clips here were just a few that I managed to grab of Gary's Phantom a couple of years before those Telford Show pictures, and Gary was just getting the bike prepped to take to the track at the 2019 Kendall Classic Revival Scramble, because I was just so intrigued that day to see one of these Phantoms actually taking part in a vintage scramble, and that was really the main reason that I grabbed these particular clips. And actually one of my first thoughts was that it can't be easy for the likes of Gary to keep this bike running and still on the track, because I thought that spare parts might be a bit difficult to source for these Phantoms nowadays, although I do remember Gary telling me that you can still get spares for these old Phantoms if you get them direct from Spain. So it's quite nice to know that there are some parts suppliers who still stock original bits and pieces to help keep these rare bikes, such as Gary's Phantom, back on the racetrack. Although, as I said, I was quite taken aback when I saw Gary's bike getting ready to take to the track, as most of the Phantoms I've come across in the last 20 years or so have all been very nicely restored bikes, and most of them are all part of rare motorcycle collections. But you've got to applaud Gary for his commitment to his old Ossa Phantom, because, as I said before, you certainly don't see many of these bikes racing nowadays. And I don't know exactly why that is, because back in 1974 or 75 these were still pretty good bikes, but maybe it's because that they never had the worldwide distribution or sales that some of those more popular models enjoyed. Although, in sharp contrast to the very nice condition of Gary's 250 Phantom, this is another kind of barn find Phantom that I came across a few years back. And although this isn't a fully original 250 from that same 1974 or 75 era, this bike here still has the potential to be made into another decent race bike, or maybe even a bike that could be restored and then brought back to life once again and used as possibly a showpiece item, or maybe to add to some lucky person's classic Twinshock Scrambles bike collection. But as I said, at the time I shot these clips a few years ago, I'm pretty sure that the owner at that time told me it was a 1975 Mark II model, but again, don't take my word as gospel on that fact, because I'm certainly, as I said, no expert on these Phantoms, because let's face it, these bikes don't pop up every day of the week, and they're not exactly as common as maybe, say, a Myco, but again, as I said, these Phantoms are becoming rarer as each year passes, and this is only the second example of these Phantoms I've ever seen in the last 20 years or so. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the actual owner's done with this bike since I snapped these video clips. He may have already moved the bike on or even restored it. Who knows, but nevertheless, I'm sure this would make a great restoration starter project, because it still has all of the basic and most important parts, which are the chassis, the forks, the tank, wheels, seat, and of course, most importantly, that 250 two-stroke piston port engine, which again is much the same 250 piston port two-stroke engine that we had a look at on Gary's bike previously, and this power plant here even still has the original Bing carburetor that Osa fitted back in 1975. But I'm not sure if this engine was actually in running condition when I covered it a couple of years ago, but of course that's not something that couldn't be put right with just a little bit of fettling or even a full engine rebuild. Although I do remember that this kickstart lever was said to be one of the annoying parts on this motor, as riders often complained that if you stuck your left leg forward to help you take a left-handed corner, it would always seem to get stuck in the top of your boot, and it also had a bad habit of swinging out when you didn't want it to, but it was still quite an easy enough job just to rig up some kind of securing strap to stop it folding out. Although, as I mentioned, these Phantom 250 engines did have their little niggles and idiosyncrasies, just like any other off-road two-stroke engine, but they were still quite light and powerful power plants, and I'm certainly not implying here that these were the very best two-stroke engine to fit inside a motocross chassis in 1975, but what they were was a very good, solid, reliable power plant that developed good power and was certainly well suited to that light steel Osa motocross chassis. And once again, the front suspension forks on our example here look like the original Beta units from 1975, which, as I said, were good, but maybe not great, but certainly good enough for your average weekend club racer to cope with. But if you were a bit of a top rider, then you'd maybe have to replace these with something of better quality. Now, the 1975 Ossa Phantom 250 did have quite small brake drums for a 250 dirt bike, but back in the day, remember that the Dirt Bike magazine journalists of that time said that these were still pretty adequate for old school stoppers, and this rear brake in particular was certainly the better of the two. But you have to remember that this was the motorcycle braking technology of the 1970s, and those ultra modern high-tech hydraulic disc brakes were still a few years down the track before then being fitted to motocross machines of the future. Now, I just haven't a clue as to what make of rear shocks are fitted onto this Phantom. These may even be a pair of old road bike suspension units that the owners thrown onto the back of this bike just to hold up the rear. But as you're aware, it would again have been a set of Spanish-made beater shocks that would have been bolted onto this Osa in 1975. But again, on this particular bike, those old shocks are nothing that can't be sorted if someone does decide to restore or put this bike back on the racetrack. But once more, and as in Gary's Phantom, the traditional underslung exhaust expansion chamber once again, which many manufacturers, as I said, were still using in the early 1970s, but I'm not entirely convinced here that this pipe is still the original item, which I suppose you have to expect on an old dirt bike that's clocking on to nearly 48 years old now. But as I mentioned, these Phantom 250s did have quite a noisy tailpipe on the stock machine, and it wasn't unusual to see riders cutting off this tailpiece to then weld on a better and quieter silencer. And once again, these Ossa Phantom fuel tanks were certainly among some of the nicest looking motorcycle fuel cells on an old 70s Twinshock motocrosser, and the paintwork and striping on our example here is a bit worn out and fading, but when these were brand new back in the day, these were stunning looking fuel cells with that bright blue and orange themed livery, and of course not forgetting those factory made indentations at the front of the tank to help accommodate the top of the fork stanchions when they were put on full left or right lock. Now, although our particularly scruffy looking 250 Phantom doesn't have the looks it once enjoyed from 1975, it still has a lot of its original parts, including this soft and comfortable seat, which, as I recall, was one of the finer points on this model from back in the day.
But again, the handlebars, grips, cables and levers are probably not the correct 1975 parts, and the plastics are also not correct for this machine. But nonetheless, what a great starter bike for a restoration, because as I said, it has all of the important bits as a base to work from, and who knows, by now it may have already been refurbished as we speak. But there you have it, two very different examples of the classic Ossa 250 Phantom. This nice bike from Gary Warr, filmed at the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, and this contrasting barn find that I captured just a few years back. But again, it's just great to take a look around another one of those iconic classic twin shockers from the early 1970s.
Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that walk around those couple of nice examples of Spanish-made Ossa Phantom 250 bikes. As I said, it's a machine that you virtually never ever see on a racetrack here in the UK these days, but it's thanks to the likes of Gary Warr, who uses his particular Phantom on a regular basis, that we can still get a chance to take a look at these very rare machines. So coming up next here on CDB TV, we're going to take a look at this 1982 DR500 Suzuki four-stroke bike. Now, this bike used to belong to a friend of mine who bought this particular machine as a standby or second bike. So we're going to take a look at this four-stroke Suzuki DR500 when we return to CDB TV. But until then, of course, everybody out there, continue to be safe and well when you're riding those old classic dirt bikes, and I hope to see you back here again very soon so we can all talk about more of this old school vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.